Restoration Passion, Panzer IV, Alf's Model H, made by Volmag.
So this treatment is called Zimmerit, and at a point in the war they became very worried about magnetic shape charges that could be stuck onto the tank with a magnet. It's a dry pin steel, so the pin is the only thing holding it together. There's no bearings or lubrication or anything, it's just metal on metal. This piece is bolted to the hull with those bolts.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That was awesome. That was cool. You can't just put it in gear and zone out. Like, you actually have to drive this thing. Theoretically, it's very simple. This does this does that. There's no confusion. Physically and mentally, like, it's not easy, it's hard, yeah. I want to thank Randy and his team. This is a massive piece for us to cover on the channel, and Randy and his team have restored this tank and they have done an amazing job. So welcome to the channel. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you.
This is a beautiful piece. I'll be very honored to say that I put this together, but you guys...
Yeah, come to find out it was easy.
Yeah.
It was hardly no work at all.
Yeah, you just buy it on the net, parts kit, and
yeah.
I hear there's one of those over there, like an 80% Panzer parts kit.
Yeah, we're working on number 2, putting together an all original hull.
Okay, cool. This thing is so rare, like it's amazing, but the rarity of a piece like this, especially in the United States, that's almost fully functional, like, or basically fully functional. So before we get into it, tell us about, first off, to those who don't know, like, who you are and what's Panzer Fabrik, what do they do?
Well, again, my name's Randy Beard. Panzer Fabrik is the brand. Been working on armor since late 90s, and have always, my whole life, been passionate about World War II German armor specifically. It seems to be the rarest, and it's got cachet to it, and it's just an interesting subject.
Okay, so where was the pivot point where you tanks became a thing for you, if you can remember that far back?
Tanks were always a thing. So yeah, my grade school doodles, were tanks and little stick figures and airplanes shooting them and things like that. So tanks have always been with me, although I was never in the military, so I don't have any practical military tank experience. So I've toured Panzer IV wrecks around the world, collected massive amounts of used parts, ground dug parts, new old stock parts. So there's a lot of research has gone into this thing on how it ticks. And in the construction phase, it's bringing all of that together into a very specific tank from a very specific time frame, very specific model. Everything has to be just so. So a lot of background had to be done to pull this off.
Okay, so today's episode is basically going to be a general in-depth, and we're going to dive into the mechanics of this thing and how this thing actually, how it works, and then how it was developed, and any of the historical points we can put on that. And then stay tuned for another episode. We're going to dive into the challenges that you guys had on the full restoration. Now that we've met Randy, tell us about this tank. What is this, and where did it come from?
Okay. The reason that this tank is exactly the way it is I mentioned it's a long process to accumulate parts. Most things are ground dug out of Eastern Europe, or God knows where. I mean, they just come from everywhere. And so I had to collect up a massive amount of parts and then try to figure out which parts agree with which models. And the Panzer IV had many iterations over its life. So it began the war, and it's the only tank that ended the war. It served the entire thing. There's multiple models, multiple upgrades, different manufacturing plants. So all of these things created nuanced differences. So if you study the Panzer IV and you specifically look at the details of it, they're all very unique. And by the detail of them, you can pinpoint to a specific manufacturer and a specific date point. So I had to take all of the parts that I had and then figure out what it was that what could I bring together and build accurately. And that happens to be very specific time frame. We're saying December of 43 through January of 44, and manufactured by a company called Vomag, one of 3 manufacturers at the time for Panzer IVs.
Okay, and so is this particular version sort of earlier on in the war or later on in the war, or where are we at with this iteration here?
So for the Panzers that are out there surviving and on black and white footage and stuff, the most iconic and stereotypical Panzer IV is pretty much this model. It was, the H was the most widely produced. It's the one that was the most numerous in famous battles like Normandy. At the time the Allies invaded. You can think of the word Ausführung in German is like model. So you have Ausführung A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and then J. So this being an H, it was, again, the time frame in the war, it was like when the war was peaking, there was more H's made than any other tank.
Okay, so. Yeah. And then one more thing before we dive into the individual components. German armor has that reputation from movies and documentaries and all the rest of it of being overly complicated, hard to produce, hard to manufacture, and some say ultimately that was what caused a lot of their demise in the tank warfare scheme of things. Everybody knows the story, like the US were able to put 6 Shermans on the ground to every 1 German tank or whatever the figures are. But a lot of that is talk and people's opinions based off what they read somewhere else. You've actually built this thing like ground up. So from a guy who's put this thing together, if anyone has an opinion that actually holds weight behind it, what are your thoughts on the German stuff being really complex and complicated? And then how did that carry over with their overall position in the war with tanks?
Okay. So yeah, the commonly held belief is that all German tanks are superior and supreme, but it's like you can't paint anything really with one brush, right? So the time period, it goes from the German tank design from the early 30s through 1945 when it was all over. Well, of course, there was major technology advances. So the basic core Panzer IV was one of the earlier tanks ever produced. It was primarily designed in the 30s, and if you think about the history of tanks, when this thing was being designed, they didn't really know what a tank looked like. So there was a lot of experimentation, a lot of crazy ideas put to use during the in-between war period. And so the 2 that came out of what we think of as a main battle tank in World War II is the Panzer III and the Panzer IV. And so they're constructed basically the same, but there's some significant differences between the Panzer III and the Panzer IV. The early tanks had kind of 3 sections. There's like, think of it as a birthday cake. You have the lower section, which is the hull. The second section is the Aufbau or superstructure, and it kind of bolts and sets on top of the hull. And then you have the turret on top. Later in the war with the Panthers and the Tigers, and they thought of better ways to do this. And so you'll see like one entire hull with the turret setting on top of it. So kind of a monolithic kind of structure rather than a pieced together structure. In photographs that you see destroyed German tanks on the battlefield, when you see a Panther or a Tiger or one of the later models, you'll see a burned out hull, but you can pretty well tell that's a Panther. When you see destroyed Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, they're like Brillo pads. When these things exploded, everything's being held together by bolts and flanges and things like that. So all of these pieces and parts that go together to make the overall tank, boom, go skyward. So Panzer IV wrecks are nothing pretty to look at. They just look like a tangled mass of metal.
And why is that? Is that due to the thickness of the armor or the welds or what?
Yeah, I think it's going back to that 30s mindset of what a tank looks like. How do you build a tank? And this is what they came up with. Unfortunately, they've figured out along the way that you can't take two heavily armored pieces and bolt them together with 10 millimeter bolts, 12 millimeter bolts, and have them hold together in an explosion.
Right.
So even though this looks like a monolithic piece, it's actually bolts holding the thing together.
We talked about all the iterations of this thing and how many upgrades it had, but the Germans also had more advanced stuff like Panther and Tiger and King Tiger. If this had those issues, why didn't they just do away with it and roll out more of those other advanced tanks?
Well, my theory on it is because once the war started and it kicked off and on multiple fronts and everything, Germany was in a catch-up mode from 1942 roughly. So they were trying to get ahead of the curve and using their knowledge they're gaining, invent better tanks. So the Panther and the Tiger, but it takes a long time to design and have all the sub-manufacturers build all the parts. Well, meanwhile, they don't have the luxury of saying pause on the war. The war's still going on, so they have to keep producing tanks. And so this was the best tank they had to fill that slot while they're trying to play catch up. They were just about to the point in 45 when they could actually be rolling out, Panthers and Tigers and all of the others in greater numbers. They had a whole series of tanks that was on the board to start production in 45, which it was over by then. So they never did really catch up. In the 30s, the Panzer III and the Panzer IV were kind of being developed roughly in the same time frame. Panzer III is in my view, a much better designed tank. The hull is a monolithic hull. It uses torsion bar suspension. In the design the informal design contest of the German tank industry of the 30s, the Panzer III clearly came out to be the best tank. And so that's what you see when the invasion of Poland happened. It was all Panzer IIIs. At the time, there was very few Panzer IVs made. The idea was that they would be infantry support tanks. Very thin armor. All of this armor on the front throughout was, I want to say it started even at 12 millimeter. It just wasn't an armored vehicle. It was a mobile gun platform. My thought is that there was a contest between Panzer III, Panzer IV. Who are we going to get behind? Panzer III for sure. And so Panzer IV was really not a thing. Very few in Poland, very few in France, and then came Russia, Barbarossa. Mm-hmm. And when they rolled into Russia with Panzer IIIs and they met T-34s, there was probably a giant oh crap moment. It's like, oh my gosh, our tanks don't hang.
Now, at that time, are we talking 76 mil T-34 or with the Russians with the 85
This
mil?
would be the 76. But even the Panzer IIIs at the time had 37 millimeter guns. Okay. They were lighter tanks. They couldn't penetrate the hull of the T-34. It was still a beefy, monstrous tank. It was a beast compared to the Panzer III. So I can imagine that there was a design meeting some point in Germany when they said, oh man, we have got our hands full now. What are we going to do? We need better tanks today. What can we do? And so everybody looks around the table and they say, well, there's this old Panzer IV design. Maybe we can do something with that. So they said, okay, let's strap a bunch more armor on it. It's got a bigger turret, bigger turret ring. It'll take a bigger gun. We can throw more weight on it because we won't squish the torsion bars. This suspension system, you could load it up as much as you could put on it. So they made a switch. They said, let's take that Panzer IV and take it out of the archives here, take it out of the closet, and we're going to make a tank out of it. And so they went to work doing that. And so you started seeing rapid development with the Panzer IV, putting longer guns in it that went into Africa and went into Russia. And so there was the switch where Panzer III had reached a design peak. They couldn't put more armor on it. They couldn't put a bigger gun in it. And it just kind of went off to the side. And the Panzer IV was beefed up to fill its void.
And at that point, was that still predominantly infantry support, or now we're dealing with like anti-tank role as well?
Well, once it gets into that, once in this phase that I'm talking about now, and it has a bigger gun, there was a shorter barrel, 75, an L42, 3, and then the L48 is the gun that's represented here. So they became a high velocity gun with a big round. So at the point they strapped these guns into this platform, it became a tank killer at that point. It wasn't a tank killer before, then it became a main battle tank. So that's when they started pushing them out as fast as they possibly could and upgrading, which meant the different Ausführungs, more armor.
Okay. And then a bit of trivia, like Randy was kind enough to lend out some of the uniforms to go with the theme today. But you mentioned last night something I never knew. Tell me about the Goering, the Air Force guy, had a Panzer unit. Tell me about the uniform and that real quick.
So the whole governmental structure in Germany was basically personality based. So you had very strong personalities in there. Hermann Goering was the chief of the Air Force, or the Luftwaffe, and so that was his big thing because he was a pilot in World War I. So somewhere along the line, Hermann Goering, the Luftwaffe chief, decided he wanted to have a Panzer Division too. It's like, I want a Panzer Division in my name. So he had a lot of stroke and a lot of pull, so he created his own Panzer Division. And so the Hermann Goering Panzer Division was an elite unit because if he had a lot of pull, he got a lot of the good equipment coming out, a lot of the supplies. And so you actually had an Air Force tank division, which was a formidable tank division. Fought a lot in Italy, ended up its campaign in around Poland in the east. But anyways, it's an interesting thing for tank people because it's such a weird blend of Army pieces and SS pieces and Luftwaffe pieces that the uniform is unique to Panzer uniforms.
Well, on that, wearing this thing out here, I am hot as shit right now. I'm going to strip off and we'll keep going.
So speaking back to the conception that people have of all German tanks being superior, we have to step back and remember what I said about this being designed in the 30s. It was never, ever originally designed to do what it later was tasked with doing. So there's some inherent design issues that are also assets to it. Primarily in the way that the hull is constructed, it has a very, very, very thin floor. So the bottom of the hull is 9 millimeter, 10 millimeter, something.
That's not much.
Something like that.
Yeah.
I get why they did this. I mean, in concept, it sounds good, but in practicality, it's not. So this tank basically has its fuel tanks on the outside of the fighting compartment. So I think the logic would have been is like, hey, let's don't put our fuel in with our guys, right? Mm-hmm. So the underneath side of the Panzer IV has dropout floor plates, and the fuel tanks fit up inside this way, and then the floor plates are bolted back on. So it sounds good, but I think that a Panzer IV rolling over a mine, or literally crawling over a giant rock or a tree stump, could collapse the fuel tank section. So you could be knocked out by a good tree stump, possibly. I can't imagine that did not happen as weakly constructed as the floor is.
Yeah, so a good point on that is a lot of guys like to sit on the internet and Tiger vs. Sherman and the best tank, but you brought up a good point of, and that shows a bit of testament to the German mindset was, you can't just go into the process of like, let's make the best tank. There's a lot of other considerations that fall in there. Like first off, your ability to actually produce that tank in any numbers, the engineering aspect, so you can have the best concept, but if your engineer's designing it can't meet those parameters, you're already back a seat. And then 3 is the economical and political factors. So a lot more considerations go into tank design than just let's make the best tank that can do all this stuff on the battlefield. And I suppose whilst the Germans are developing better tanks, they're using that adaptive ability to, because their situation at the time with all the strategic bombing from the Allies, they're losing factories and damage and all that. They're still able to adapt and use what was available and upgrade that, because the reality was building a tank from the ground up in that situation is not, it's sometimes not, it's not feasible.
It takes years.
Yeah.
So you've touched on the yes part of, is this a good tank? The yes part of why this is a good tank is it's relatively low technology. This, again, 1930s stuff, right? So that you can, the bogey wheels on the side of the hull, they can basically be placed anywhere. And we found, when I was trying to determine exactly the dimensions of the Panzer IV, we found that the bogey wheels, they all vary. So during the manufacturing time, they'd turn the hull upside down, slap the thing up, and say roughly 1 meter apart, and drill holes. So they'll all vary. We found no exact jig-built statistics on lengths and widths and heights on the Panzer IV. The variances go throughout. It almost feels like a cottage-built tank, where other companies are making subparts. They're going to an assembly place, and they're having to actually make modifications to fit these pieces together. But the good thing about that is their production could keep rolling. They didn't have to have the super machinery to mill for a torsion bar alignment and complex arrangements for the steering components and all of these other things. It's tractor stuff. So it will not perform with the more modern tanks that came out later in World War II and some of the Allied tanks, but you know what? They could keep making it no matter how many bombs were dropped, no matter how off the pieces were. You can build this tank, and that's what they continue to do throughout the war. That's why there's so many of them. And again, they just never could get away from that. Sure, they wanted to have all Panthers and Tigers, just couldn't get away from the Panzer IV. With the gun, with a good frontal armor, you know, it's a good deadly tank, right? So this gun was super gun, could reach out and touch the enemy at a great distance, extremely accurately, penetrate. So as long as you've got a good carriage that could take a hit, and you can hit them at a distance, you got a viable tank. And they just produced them in numbers.
And that kind of sums up the point of, whilst they're like, let's design these more advanced tanks, Tiger One and so on and so forth, this was kind of like an insurance policy.
Exactly.
Yep.
It's been called the workhorse of the German army, and it truly is that. It's not a workhorse because it's the best. It's the workhorse because they could keep it running, they could keep it killing the enemy, and keep producing it brand new. So in that sense, it's a great tank.
Yep. And real quick, touch on interchangeable parts. So how much of this tank could run spares and be swapped out with the earlier iterations of Panzer IV, and then we go back to Panzer III or forward to Tiger One and Panther? What of this tank would be interchangeable with those other vehicles?
I think there was custom fit on a lot of the pieces here.
Yep.
So not necessarily one Aufbau could be bolted off of one and set on another one. The holes don't line up because this is all shop done by just people with drills. Okay. Right? But you can drill new holes. So they could reproduce these, remanufacture them by taking the components, making the modifications, the slide adjustments, and then put together a new tank. A lot of the tanks came out of reproduced Panzer IVs, like the flak Panzers, some of the, I think, early Jagdpanzer, maybe the Alket version.